Welcome to It's Alive, where we host a space every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern, to talk about developments in the world of UBI and meet with the people behind the headlines. I'm Scott Santons. I've been researching, writing, and advocating for the concept of UBI since 2013. For those new to the concept, UBI stands for Unconditional or Universal Basic Income. It's the idea that every individual in a society can and should be guaranteed a periodic cash payment without means test or work requirement in order to make their way in the world upon a firm foundation. I recently started the Income to Support All Foundation, or ITSA Foundation, which provides support to projects that aim to make UBI a reality through research, storytelling, and implementation. You can learn more at itsafoundation.org. I am usually joined by my co-hosts Conrad Shaw and Josh Worth, but neither of them were able to make it today. So it's just me, but we still do have a special guest whose name is Neil Coleman. And our topic today will be the potential of basic income in South Africa. Just a little about Neil for those of you who are interested in learning more. Neil Coleman is co-founder and senior policy specialist at the Institute for Economic Justice, or IEJ, a progressive economic policy and advocacy think tank launched in 2018 by a group of South African academics, activists, and policy experts. The IEJ's core objective is to provide policymakers and progressive social forces in South Africa with access to rigorous economic analysis and well thought through policy options to address the multiple socioeconomic challenges confronting the country. In addition to his role in the IEJ Leadership Collective, he's led the Institute's work on pioneering the introduction of a Universal Basic Income Guarantee, or UBIG, in South Africa, a matter which has now become the subject of a major national debate, and that debate is what we'll be talking about today. But first, before we get to our topic of basic income in South Africa, I always like to cover a little bit of recent news. So what's been going on in the world of basic income around the world, and just to get everyone up to speed and make sure everyone kind of, stays in the loop. So just some recent news is there's a new pilot that caught my eye in San Francisco. It's called the It All Adds Up pilot. And this is another kind of unique, kind of first of its kind pilot where they'll be looking at families who have recently experienced homelessness, and they want to see kind of the long-term or longer-term impact of basic income on those people. So this will be 225 families. They'll get $1,000 per month for 12 months, but this will be a randomized controlled trial for 5 years. So really kind of get a better idea of not only the reduction of immediate homelessness, but like homelessness prevention. You'll be able to compare between the treatment group and the control group over the 5 years' time to see really just how much of an impact even just 1 year of basic income can make. I can add that in the replies. People know where to learn more, but it's at italladdsup, sf.org. If you'd like to learn more about that. Another piece of recent news is that the Texas Supreme Court has temporarily blocked, potentially permanently blocked, the Harris County pilot that was about to start in Texas. And so again, Texas has already had multiple successful pilots, but this was one they wanted to stop this one before it started. And so the day before the payments started going out, the Supreme Court overruled a previous ruling that was agreeing or disagreeing with the attempt to block this from happening. So at this point, it's up to the Supreme Court to decide if there will be any more such pilots in Texas or not. But it was really, really unfortunate that all these people were already expecting to receive this money for a year and a half, and just a day before they started getting the money, the Supreme Court stepped in and said no. So that's interesting on the negative side. And then there's another court ruling that's more positive, and this was in Ontario, Canada. And we've discussed this before. We just 2 weeks ago we had actually some participants from the pilot and to speak about this. And there's a lawsuit a class action lawsuit in Ontario going forward because of the premature cancellation of that pilot, where 1 year into a 3-year pilot, a switch of government came in, the new premier came in and canceled this. And so this has been working through the courts. It just got the approval as a class action lawsuit. And that's something we discussed 2 weeks ago. But then since then, there has been an initial ruling from the court saying that that the legal fees needs to be covered by the government of what's been accrued so far. So this is the Ford administration has to pay $320,000 to cover all those legal fees accrued so far. So yeah, that's a positive development, at least, to make sure that they're that this lawsuit can continue and that they can afford to do that. Another new thing, there's a new California bill to provide cash to high school seniors. This would be just a select group to kind of counter what's considered summer melt, which is where high school graduates are accepted into college and intend to enroll, but ultimately don't, usually due to their homelessness. So this would provide $1,200 per month for that kind of critical 4-month window for 50 homeless students. And it's just another kind of interesting pilot where in California, like one of the first ones that they did was focused on kids exiting foster care. And now the same person behind that one, Dan Cortez, state lawmaker, is also doing this or trying to get this done next. So we'll see what happens to that one. Let's see, and then another study came out. Again, this is like having to do with homelessness and stuff. This was a report that came out from for prominent Los Angeles academics that said a monthly payment of $750 to $1,000 per month would allow thousands of the city's homeless people to find informal housing, living in boarding homes and shared apartments, and with family and friends. This kind of informal housing is something that I think a lot of people kind of don't really consider. And it's been observed in these pilots that have focused on homelessness, which is where, people think, oh, you can't possibly afford, rent in San Francisco with a $500 per month basic income, and just because of how expensive it is. But then what we end up seeing is that people say use this, they have a friend and they wouldn't have asked to stay with them, if they didn't have any money at all. But now that they have $500 a month and they're able to give them something, and or they're able to use that to move somewhere else. And this kind of informal housing is this option that really opens up through basic income. So it's good to see more of that being discussed. And finally, I just also want to mention that the Chicago pilot was such a success that they're going to do another round of that, kind of like a phase two of that pilot, because they've Chicago has a bunch of money that they need to spend of the federal uh, funding from COVID, and they need to make sure and allocate and spend these funds. So they're looking at what they spent on that's actually worked versus really what hasn't. And so since that has worked, they are going to go ahead and do another round of that. So yeah, good news out of Chicago. All right, so with all that covered, Neil, yeah, welcome to the space, and I'm really looking forward to just learning more about what's going on in South Africa, and just kind of going to start off with just a summary of just kind of what's been going on the past like few years and what's led up to this kind of real jump in potential in South Africa, like post COVID.
Thanks very much, Scott, and thanks for inviting us. I think the discussion around basic income in South Africa goes back a couple of decades to 1998, in fact. But I'm not really going to talk about that long history. I can talk about it later if you and people in the space are interested.
Sure.
But the real sort of leap forward, if you like, happened with the COVID crisis in 2020. Government introduced various sorts of mitigation measures as part of a sort of stimulus package, but also to assist people. We had 2 million people thrown out of work. And we had a pre-existing crisis in South Africa, which was just made much more evident by the COVID crisis. And so the levels of hunger and poverty in South Africa were already extreme, but the COVID crisis, I think, just exacerbated it to such an extent that the introduction of an income transfer, of a cash transfer, which is called the COVID SRD grant. SRD stands for Social Relief of Distress. 350 rand in South African currency, which is about $18 in American currency, became so important in staving off the most extreme forms of hunger that when it was lifted in early 2021, there was a political upheaval in South Africa which led to looting in July 2021, widespread disturbances in the country. And while it was linked to political issues, which I won't go into now, the underlying socioeconomic reality was that people were desperate, and in essence, you had sort of food riots. Although South Africa is classified as an upper middle income country, those are aggregates. The actual reality for the vast majority of people is, poverty and hunger. Over 50% of the population is classified as living in poverty, and one in every 5 households are actually sending out a member of the household to beg for food on a regular basis. And that's the situation now, even after some, revival after the worst days of the COVID crisis. So this really gave impetus to the campaign by trade unions and civil society organizations for the introduction of basic income, which, as I said, had been a pre-existing campaign and had been a big policy debate in political circles in South Africa for some time. But it now became a really live debate, which gained critical sort of support from virtually every segment of society, with a couple of exceptions. We now are going into elections on the 29th of May in South Africa, and it's quite significant. The Institute for Economic Justice that I work for, as you indicated, is a member of a basic income coalition called the Universal Basic Income Coalition. And that coalition has done a sort of an audit of all the political party manifestos for these elections. And it's very significant that a number of those parties are supporting the introduction of the basic income, despite quite a degree of conservatism, both in the governing party and other parties in South Africa on economic issues and macroeconomic issues. So, this will be a major commitment in the country, but I think that those sorts of factors that I was outlining, including over 40% unemployment, which translates to over 11 million unemployed people, there's these levels of hunger and poverty and so on, are such a powerful sort of reality that a campaign for basic income has won enormous support, including amongst the president of the country, who today, in a speech to workers at May Day or Labor Day, as you guys call it, said that the campaign for a basic income is supported. It's something that is going to be realized, and the ANC itself, the governing party, in its elections manifesto, has supported transitioning from the social relief of distress grant, which at its peak went to about 11 million people. And I should just indicate that those 11 million people, plus their dependents, actually meant that the social relief distress grant was having an impact, a beneficial impact on over half the South African population. So the president and others in government have supported the transitioning of that grant to a basic income. And of course, we as the Civil Society Coalition and the IEJ and the unions are supporting movement towards a universal basic income, just as you are campaigning for in the States. But this is a incremental sort of process, and what we've done is we've modeled different pathways towards achieving that universal basic income. In the meantime, we have many challenges with the existing grant, which I can talk about a bit later if you like, Scott, which have led us to actually take government to court on the current grant, which is very inadequate and very exclusionary. But nevertheless, it is a national grant. It's not a pilot in a particular area. It goes to people in every part of the country, and therefore probably in the global south may be the first sort of example of a embryonic national basic income.
Could you?
And that's why we are very excited about this possibility of becoming the first country to implement a basic income on that scale.
Yeah, could you provide just some details about the SRD grant, and like details as in not necessarily amount, but like what do people have to do in order to get it, and how is that different than other programs that have existed or exist in
Yes.
South Africa?
I wonder if you could make my colleague who's here, Dr. Kelly Housen, a speaker, Scott, because she could speak a bit about that.
Sure.
Has been working extensively on the issue. And as I said, in this court case, we're challenging different aspects of this SRD grant, relates to both the administration, the exclusion, of course, means testing, etc., as is practiced in other parts of the world, excludes large numbers of people. So I don't know if Kelly, sorry to ambush you like this, I don't know if you want to come in on, talk a little bit about the features of the SRD grant. I don't know if you've made her a speaker.
I've invited her, so we'll need to wait until she accepts the invite.
She just messaged me to say she's not in a position to do this.
Oh,
I think
okay.
she might be. I think she might be in a public play with friends and so on. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. And Sianda Baduza, who's also in our team, is also present. He can also come in at some point. But yeah, Scott. So basically, initially, the grant was, fairly loosely implemented. So people who had no means of income could apply, but the means test was very sort of loosely applied. And what happened is our national treasury, the finance department, was strongly opposed to the SRD grant and tried to terminate it on multiple occasions.
Mm.
And what happened was after the state of disaster was lifted, in other words, when the COVID regulations were ended and the grant was extended, what happened was our national treasury set some very hard conditions, which required people to prove via their bank accounts that they had an income which was no greater than a certain amount. In fact, that $18 that we were talking about, that was subsequently increased to 600, just over 600 rand. And so, as a result of this, people had to get verified via bank accounts. They had to apply this via digital platforms, etc. I see Kelly is now a speaker. I don't know whether she's in a position to come in. Kelly, do you want to come in?
Can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, sure. Yeah, I've managed to sneak away to a quieter place now. Yeah, the SRD grant, Neil, I think you were talking about the extent of exclusion from the SRD grant. And that's happened through a number of kind of complex procedural and administrative issues. But I think the important kind of underlying factor in that exclusion has really been the fact that the budget allocation given to the SRD grant was always arbitrarily low, and it was always too little to cover the amount of beneficiaries who should be eligible for that grant based on the eligibility criteria. So because of that arbitrarily low budget allocation, the Department of Social Development and the other agencies providing the grant needed to find ways to prevent people from actually accessing it, to put it simply. And they did that through a number of measures. I mean, the SRD grant is the only grant in South Africa that can only be applied for online. And we've got at least 20% digital exclusion. So that's already a huge barrier to the most vulnerable. They've also instituted a quite invasive system of bank verification. So they check people's income eligibility through monthly checks on their bank account. And this is flawed for a lot of different reasons. It can't account for what should be considered regular income. It also includes income held on behalf of others. We know a lot of people in South Africa share bank accounts. So bank verification ends up wrongfully excluding a lot of people from the SRD grant. So even though the SRD grant really is a basis for campaigning for a more expansive basic income and even a universal basic income, and in many ways it helps us make our case against targeting, the concern is that if it is transitioned into a basic income, that these unfair provisions could be carried over into the infrastructure that is used to administer that grant.
Yeah. So, what's an example? Like you said that there's this policing of income with the SRD grant, and are we talking cliff effect? 100% cliff effect, where someone is getting the SRD grant and they get whatever the maximum income is, whichever that is, and you can share that again, whatever that income is, and then the next dollar, with that dollar, then they lose the entire grant, and that's done. Is there any kind of phase out, at all, or any attempt, any kind of phase out, or is it really just an on off again kind of switch with the grant?
It's decided on a monthly basis, and the means test threshold for the grant is extremely low. It's below the food poverty line or the extreme poverty line in South Africa. So even people who are living in food poverty, who, by Statistics South Africa's definition, can't meet their food intake requirements
Mhm.
may not be eligible to receive that grant. And it is, I guess, I haven't heard the term cliff effect, Scott, but I think that it is as you described. So if you have 1 rand above the threshold, you're excluded. And as I said, it's assessed on a monthly basis. So you might have, if we take somebody's income over an average of 3 months, you might have income below the means test in all of those 3 months. But if it's assessed monthly, you might be falling a lot below the threshold, even if you are, falling above the threshold, even if you are, objectively in food poverty.
Yeah,
Mhm.
maybe I can add a couple of points, Scott. Is our child support grants and our old age pension, although
Mhm.
they means tested, they are pretty well targeted. According to Development Pathways, for example, they've looked at international means testing, and the South African child support grant and old age pension come out pretty well. And the reason for that is that there's sort of what's called affluence testing. So the threshold, the income threshold, is set very high. Whereas with this SRD grant, it's set extremely low, below half the actual, the real poverty line is more than double the threshold that we're talking about. As Kelly said, the threshold that's set is just below the food poverty line, but it's less than half the actual, what's called the upper bound poverty line. What that means in the end is that millions of people who are living in poverty are excluded from applying for the grant. And there are other problems, for example, databases that are flawed and inaccurate, etc. Anyway, all these issues are currently before the court. The IEJ and our partner organization Pay the Grant have brought a court case. Another sort of related element of this is the value of the grant. As we indicated, it's extremely low, way below even the food poverty line. And we have gone to the courts to say that the way in which this is being eroded by inflation, it's stayed pretty much the same level since 2020, that this is a retrogression in the constitutional right to social assistance. The South African Constitution provides that you need to progressively realize this right to social assistance, and social assistance has to be given to all those who are unable to support themselves and their families. So this is going to be a challenge that moves into the Constitutional Court. But politically in South Africa, the reality is that you've got your National Treasury, as I said, an extremely conservative institution, pitted against the other players in government and civil society and the governing party, who are all supporting this notion of progressive improvement and the introduction of some form of basic income. And unfortunately, the business community here as well, although they benefit from the SRD grant as a result of increased purchasing of retail and other goods, they also have taken quite a conservative approach on this matter. So the contestation is very sharp in South Africa, and really we will only see after the elections which way this matter is going to go.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the court cases stuff. I'm not super familiar with the court cases in South Africa. I suppose this is, like I said, it's around the SRD grant, but then is this like kind of basically trying to improve the grant through the courts uh, by doing, like, I don't know, like a workaround to getting politicians to, pass a bill or whatever to
Yeah,
improve the way the SRD grant is done? And in which case, what are all like the little improvements? Is it like
yeah.
around like stopping or improving like the income testing through the bank accounts, and like the having something more than just online applications and stuff?
Yeah, no, exactly. I'll say a couple of things and then Kelly can come in, and our colleague Sianda is also, welcome to come in. So, yes, it's precisely as you were saying. It's to say that some of these provisions in the regulations. Remember, I said that in 2022 these regulations were introduced from April 2022, which excluded a whole lot of people who now had to apply via online, had to have bank accounts, etc., etc., etc. And basically, what we're arguing is that those aspects of those regulations are unlawful, that there needs to be a hybrid system of applying, that you should need to be able to apply either online if you can, or physically, if because people apply physically for other grants apart from the SRD grant, that this retrogression in the value of the grant needs to be corrected. Kelly will add in terms of some of the other elements, but it's requiring the state to put in place a plan to rectify these sort of unconstitutional, unlawful elements, and the court might actually strike down certain elements of the regulations. I don't know, Kelly, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that the something important to mention and something kind of underlying the court case is the fact that South Africa has a provision in its constitution that everybody has the right to social security, including social assistance if they are unable to provide for themselves or their dependents. So that theoretically, technically covers a large proportion of the population. I mean, over half the population lives in poverty and is unable to properly provide for themselves and their dependents. And the constitutional right to social assistance must be progressively realized. So the Constitution requires the government to build on this right. It acknowledges that we can't necessarily give adequate social assistance to everyone in South Africa tomorrow, but we must build on the foundation that has been established. So the key kind of basis of the court case is arguing that social protection that has been provided is now being rolled back. And that's happened in a few ways. Fewer people now have access to the SRD grant than they did previously because of these new exclusionary provisions that have come online. But also the SRD grant has not been increased for inflation since 2020 when it was instituted. So its value has been eroded significantly over time. Other social grants have been increased for inflation, they've been increased but below inflation. So this court case is kind of an important challenge around progressive realization and the state's obligation to use all available resources to realize and build on constitutional rights.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it's essentially unconstitutional to go backwards. That's
what we're arguing.
Yeah. As far as like the potential decisions from the court case and the elections at the end of the month, like what does that look like? Like, do you expect to have some kind of decisions prior to elections, or is that not going to happen until well after elections?
Yeah.
And elections
Yeah.
is just like
no, unfortunately, it's not. The legal process is slow, so the decisions will come after the election.
Okay.
I think it's important to just say that the legal action is not the only or the primary sort of element of our strategy as a coalition and as the IEJ. The legal action is one aspect. There's been an intense process of political engagement. There's a task team in the presidency. We met with the president in 2022. The department responsible for administering grants and for policy on grants, the Department of Social Development, is in favor of the introduction of a basic income. In fact, they're in favor of the introduction of a universal basic income, which is very significant. And at the level of the political party process, we've engaged extensively with the African National Congress, which is the governing party in South Africa, although it faces a serious challenge in these elections. And they've taken on board a lot of the proposals which civil society have made. So, for example, they support an increase of the grant to over double its current level to at least the food poverty line, which is 760 rand. They support the increase of the means test, and they support removing many of these exclusionary provisions. So, but it's a complex terrain, because what the governing party says and what happens in government are not necessarily the same thing. I suppose you might have experienced this in the US as well, with the Democratic Party and what happens in the administration, etc. But that's quite stark in South Africa, and we've got a very, very powerful treasury which has tried to take over the domain of policy making. So there are all these sort of elements of engagement and contestation which are happening in the media, with political parties, with government, with the various departments, and we've engaged in sort of quite detailed technical work, modeling of different pathways to basic income. And so if you like, the hegemony or the sort of dominance of a view that a basic income is not feasible and is a wild fantasy, which may be the case in some other countries, is not the case in South Africa. A very powerful case has been made out, and there's very strong support from multiple constituencies for the idea. So what I'm saying is, yes, the court case is very important, but there are all these other elements to the campaign which have been quite effective.
I'm curious about, just because so many people are receiving the SRD, and how, it's just not something that those who wanted to get rid of it have been successful in doing that. I'm just like, I know it's such a common response to the concept of basic income, and I know the SRD isn't basic income, but a lot of people think it is, as far as like, oh, you give people money, and in the case of the SRD, it's like, yeah, you actually lose it if you get a job, so it's not necessarily all the same as basic income, but it is helpful to have money, and it is helpful how money can actually, having some money is able to better enables people to like then find employment, or create their own employment of some kind. And so, like, do you see like people, who, like, someone would say, oh, well, you can't do that because it'll make people lazy. But then so many people are getting it that there's just a lot of anecdotes out there of people.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it works for me, like, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, the evidence is strong, Scott. I mean, there've been, various studies, and the evidence is pretty strong that it's, even at this very low level, it's stimulating economic activity. And remember, these are in the most oppressed communities. And in South Africa, the apartheid legacy is that the most marginalized and poor communities are, scattered, away from the urban centers. So the the issue of aggregate demand and economic activity in poor communities is exacerbated in South Africa. You have a very small informal sector in South Africa. You have a very small peasantry. So basically what you have is that working people, particularly the working poor, are pretty much responsible for being the social security net for their relatives who are unemployed. And so, it's not entirely the case that the SRD is only supporting people who are unemployed in the strict sense of the word. One of the strong elements of the SRD is that it's supporting caregivers. So women, for example, who have children who are getting a child support grant, poor women in a household with no income, who are not in a position to necessarily look for work, are qualified for the SRD, and there are many women in South Africa who are in that position. So that also provided a strong sort of basis for the argument that we need a much broader basic income, which is either universal or is available to, a much greater swathe of people, including the working poor. And there is very, very strong support for that because of the objective reality, which people face in these communities. I mean, one of the things is that people are moving in and out of precarious employment, and therefore their employment status is not clear at all. What National Treasury and the World Bank have tried to do is to say that, okay, if you're going to have a grant like this, then it has to be a job seekers grant. And it should only if you can prove that you're actively looking for work, should you qualify for the grant. And we fought strongly against it. I mean, the World Bank's own figures were that I think it was between 3 and 4 million people would qualify for the grant, as opposed to the 11 million people who qualified at the peak of the grant. So there are many sort of permutations which both Treasury and conservative institutions like the World Bank are trying to advance, which would involve a much sort of smaller rollout, but would also preempt the notion of universal basic income, which they are very, very afraid of, because they see that as a platform for a much broader set of sort of social economic rights, which would require very, very significant redistribution in the country.
Before I continue, just to everyone listening, if you want to retweet the space, quote tweet it to encourage others to join us, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And Neil, for the again, you mentioned the evidence that's been coming out of the SRD grant. Could you do you have like any stats to share? And what studies have been done to see like what is the kind of the impact of this, and are there studies that have like basically kind of used a control group of those who are very similar, like let's say we're on the other side of the line of qualification, just to see like the difference in receiving the SRD grant versus not receiving the SRD grant?
Sure. I think Kelly should come in on this because she's done quite a lot of work on this. In fact, has got a project running currently, which deals with the sort of the flip side of this. I don't know, Kelly, are you in a position to speak to this?
Sure. Sorry. Just if you wouldn't mind repeating the question, Scott. I think you were asking about the impact of receiving the SRD grant. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what kind of studies have been done on the SRD grant, looking at the impacts from various measures, and even if there's, kind of a, using a control group of those who are right on the other edge of qualifying, who are just, barely don't qualify, to kind of give an idea of how people do compared to, getting or not getting.
Yeah, there's actually been quite a lot of research, and look, we have to remember the SRD grant is less than half the food poverty line, so it's really a pittance. Yeah. But despite that, quite remarkably, because of its low value, it's had positive impacts on job search and employment. It's had positive impacts on local economic activity. So there was one study that came out of the University of Cape Town, which showed that in the first year of receiving the SRD grant, the likelihood that a beneficiary would enter into employment increased by 3 percentage points, or 7%. So, even despite its low value, it's having a significant impact on entry into employment. There was some other research just came out this year that showed that the average cost of searching for a job for young people in South Africa is 1,400 Rand per month. So compare that with the 350 SRD grant. It's a drop in the ocean just in terms of job search costs. And that's because in South Africa, comparatively, because of the legacy of the spatial legacy of apartheid, transport from the areas where most low-income communities live is very expensive. But even with these issues of cost, the SRD grant improved people's chance of getting into employment. And so that just shows the extent to which income poverty keeps people from participating in the economy. There was other research that showed that South Africa has, compared to most global north countries, a relatively large informal economy, although compared to middle and low income countries, a relatively small informal economy. But still, there was a paper that came out where the researchers traced the impact of the SRD grant on the incomes of informal traders in a particular local area. And that showed that the SRD grant supported consumption, increased consumption, and had a positive feedback effect in the local economy. And so it's not just that the spending on social protection increased consumption overall and in the overall economy, but that impact on consumption was concentrated in economically excluded and low income areas. So if we can extrapolate from that the kind of macroeconomic impact a grant that was actually pegged at an adequate value might have on employment, consumption, productivity.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. If you could share some of those links at some point, just in reply to this space, I'm sure listeners would like to see those studies. And I'm curious too, since this is one of the main objections, of course, just when people first hear about the concept of basic income, aside from people not working or getting lazy or whatever, it's always, this will cause inflation. This will cause inflation. This will completely eliminate the value of the basic income. You'll just raise the value of everything, the price of everything, so no one will be better off. Clearly, that's not what's being observed in South Africa, correct?
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. I think the debate around inflation is not really, it's not salient in South Africa. That's not the major objection. The major objection is this question of dependence and sort of, a narrative, which I'm sure you've heard around, people wasting the money, spending it on alcohol, whatever. But again, all the studies, including on the SRD grants, have shown that is not the case. And so, one of the things, there's an ideological contestation that's taking place, and often it's assumed that it's the wealthy and the elite who buy these narratives. But unfortunately, it's also the case that working class people and poor people also tend to buy these narratives, particularly if it's seen as something for others. And that's why the universality and its broad character, as helping all working working class communities, poor households, etc., becomes very, very important in terms of people understanding that this is something that is beneficial to everybody. And I think as it's broadened out more and more, that is better understood. I think the sort of old narrative that that people, it makes people lazy, dependent, etc. I don't think it's as powerful now as it used to be. That used to be the case, for example, in the ANC, the governing party. But I think the coalition and the organizations that are working on this issue have been more effective in beginning to make that case. But it still remains, a bit of a mountain to climb.
Do you think a part of it is there's enough people receiving the SRD and have been receiving it for long enough, or there was a long enough duration for those receiving it, that in itself helped diffuse a lot of these so very common arguments?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And there's a UN university wider study which showed that at the peak, people were getting when 10.9 million people received the grant in March 2022, that over half the population were benefiting from the grant directly and indirectly.
Mm.
So, I mean, you're talking about something with a massive footprint. So there's no doubt, that, and what Kelly was talking about, all the informal traders are seeing it, the local business people, etc. We produced a video, Scott, I don't know if you managed to watch it, but it's just a short, like 4-minute video, and we look at the impact on an informal trader, the impact on a young job seeker, and
Hmm.
the impact on a mother, and it sort of dramatizes this impact, so people can see that it's helping the young job seeker to find work because there's more economic activity in his community. Similarly, with the mother, she's not having to rely on the child support grant anymore. She can supplement the income she gets from the child support grant, and then and the informal trader, as Kelly was saying, has the benefit of this large amount of money, even though it's only 350 rand. We're talking about round about 100 billion extra rand that has gone into poor communities over the last couple of years, which wouldn't have gone in if it hadn't been for these campaigns by civil society to extend the grant. And finally, now we are confident that this is permanent and that really we need to build on this and assert, the need for a basic income. And as I said, the president today actually said in his speech, we are going to move towards the basic income. But the devil is in the detail, as Kelly said. There's the danger is to entrench a lot of the problematic features of the SRD grant. We need to completely transform that. And the elephant in the room, Scott, is that we have a paradigm of austerity in South Africa at the moment. We have very conservative macroeconomic policy. So this is in part a fight against that macroeconomic paradigm, and that's a big battle that is going to be very difficult to win.
Has there been a measurement of the multiplier effect of each dollar of the SRD grant?
Yeah, this is a sort of, again, a live debate in South Africa. There isn't. There was a study which was done recently, in fact, it was supported by the French Development Institution, which is supporting research we're doing, which is being led by Kelly, together with Sianda on the question of the exclusion of people from the SRD. So that's a study we're doing, but they did a study on the multiplier impact of the public employment schemes. There's something called the Presidential Employment Stimulus, and they were looking at the stimulus impact of that, but it was sort of quite a limited analysis. We were quite. I don't know if you've seen a recent paper by a group of academics from Sao Paulo University who've looked at the multiplier impacts of grants, particularly in global South countries, and they found very large impacts, particularly in countries with a high level of inequality. And of course, South Africa has the highest level of inequality in the world, amongst peer countries. And so we're very confident that the multiplier impact will be very significant. Apparently, there's an institution in South Africa that has approached Sao Paulo to calculate the multipliers for South Africa. So some secondary research has been done, but a lot more work still has to be done. Kelly, I don't know if you want to add on to that point at all.
Yeah, we don't have a multiplier number for you, Scott, unfortunately. There has been a lot of work on, the macroeconomic and local economic impacts of the SRD grant, but we can't point to, it's
Right.
1.3 free, etc. It continues to be done, but we are confident that the SRD grant has had a positive economic impact, and that would be very much pronounced if we transitioned to a basic income with wider coverage of an adequate value.
Yeah. I would guess it's somewhere between $2 and $3, just because it's so frequently or around there. But I was just curious if a measurement had been made, and if that was even part of the discussions, in the lead up to elections, if there were, those who were supporting expansion to basic income, if they were talking about it from this positive macroeconomic growth kind of perspective, beyond whatever other arguments that are being used for the importance of this.
Yeah. While we haven't calculated a specific multiplier, Scott, what we did do was we commissioned some modeling of pathways to basic income, and what we looked at was 3 scenarios. The one was a sort of a less ambitious scenario, one a moderately ambitious scenario, and one was a higher ambition scenario. And the ambitions related to the question of the value of the grant, the speed with which we will move towards universality, etc. I mean, I can share a paper with you. It's a long paper, but we've done a policy brief which summarizes the main findings of that paper. And I think what's very significant is, apart from the fact that it has massive impacts in terms of reduction of poverty and inequality, it also has significant macroeconomic impact in terms of growth. It has very limited impacts in terms of things like the debt level, the level of the fiscal deficit, and stuff like that. So we have presented these findings to government, and I think that other studies that have been done, for example, by an expert panel in South Africa, which together with the International Labour Organization and the Department of Social Development did a study which comes to sort of similar conclusions, that it is fiscally sustainable. I think the big debate is around which financing measures are used, and obviously we don't have the strength of the US dollar as a reserve currency to be able to, simply through monetary financing, to print money to finance it, although there can be an element of debt financing and so on. It requires a degree of progressive taxation, and the IEJ has produced a paper in which we've looked at 18 different potential financing mechanisms, including things such as a financial transactions tax.
Yeah, I really like that paper. I thought it was great. I love sharing it, even just not only for those who ask about questions about basic income in South Africa, but also just people in general to consider all the different ways of all the different taxes that can be paired with it, all the different various reforms. It's please just do like a quick summary, let people know just all these different options, and maybe even share what you would like to see most too of those options, if you have any kind of personal favorites.
Yeah, I think it's about sequencing. It's about a combination of financing measures which achieve the results that you want to achieve in a progressive way. So, firstly, the use of the term progressive. We and our allies are completely against regressive financing, where the poor are paying a significant share of the financing. And so, for example, value-added tax in South Africa, we would not be in favor of an increase in value-added tax to finance a basic income. But at the same time, while we are looking for, things like a wealth tax, where you've got such high levels of inequality in South Africa and such wealth concentration at the top of the income structure, we also support the idea, for example, of a social security tax. I know you've got a social security tax in the US, but we would look at a progressive social security tax, so that those at low income workers would pay, for example, 1% of their income in the social security tax, but higher earners would pay a greater proportion of their income. And it would be structured in a way, and our financing brief does this. It looks at structuring it in a way that all, low-income workers up to a certain threshold are receiving more back in a basic income than they are paying in taxation. So this sends a message to society that everybody's contributing. People are contributing according to their ability, to use an old expression, and receiving the benefit according to their needs. So, I think that's an important one. The wealth tax is important. Financial transaction tax is particularly attractive because it's a very, very small tax, which would hardly be noticed, but can easily be levied, through the financial system, which is very sophisticated in South Africa. But as I said, there are 18 tax modalities which we have got, listed in that brief, and people are very welcome to have a look at it, and we'd appreciate feedback.
Is there any kind of I don't remember the options just offhand in the brief, but was there any kind of resource rents kind of thing, like Alaska model kind of approach of ways of making essentially natural wealth flow to everybody instead of just to the owners of that wealth?
Yes. No, there is. I mean, as you're probably aware, South Africa is very commodity dependent, and we have these commodity booms. For example, in the mid 2000s, there was a huge commodity boom, and more recently in South Africa, after COVID, there was a massive commodity boom, and a lot of those resources were sort of redirected basically to elites through the financial sector, to retiring debt, and so on and so forth. So we one of those 18 mechanisms is to propose a resource rent tax on sort of excessive windfalls, commodity windfalls, and that's been an ongoing debate in South Africa for some time.
Right, we are in the second hour now, so everyone listening, if you anyone out there have any questions for Neil or Kelly, please click the button to request to speak, and I can uplift you so you can do that. And while we're waiting for potentially anyone to ask to speak, again, could we just talk a little bit about? We've covered the SRD grant pretty well. What, but aside from kind of the changes we've considered, like the higher amount and improving these requirements that end up excluding so many people from the SRD grant, and therefore being this improved version that we call basic income guarantee, and then go from there. What are some of these more realistic improvements to the SRD that you think could really be part of this transition from the SRD to the first basic income grant?
Kelly, I don't know if you want to respond to that, and I'll sort of add on.
Thanks. Look, I mean, the first and most immediate change that needs to be made to the SRD grant is that its value should be increased to at least the food poverty line.
Yeah.
South Africa has growing hunger and food insecurity since COVID, and that would make an enormous difference in mitigating hunger. And that's something that a few parties have pledged to do in the upcoming election. But beyond that, we believe that it is, not only feasible, but that it would have positive economic impacts to progressively expand the SRD grant to essentially universal coverage of the adult population. And that's in line with the requirement for progressive realization of social assistance in the Constitution. So that would, a commitment to universality would go a long way to addressing many of the kind of infrastructural and administrative issues that have led to exclusion in the grant. But we do acknowledge that that will take a while, that the South African fiscus is, not necessarily that robust. So the way that should be achieved in the interim is by raising the means test over time, over and above inflation. So the means test should be at least set at the upper bound poverty line now, immediately, to ensure that everybody who's in poverty is eligible for the SRD grant. After that, it can be increased progressively. There are a number of different kind of benchmarks or metrics that could be used along the way. The income tax threshold, the minimum wage. These are so these are kind of objective or collectively decided measures of adequate income that could be used as benchmarks for the SRD grant.
In regards to the diversity of support for the basic income grant and the idea of transitioning from the SRD to that, just like how many parties are out there speaking about this in hopes of increasing their representation at the end of the month with the elections, and also in addition to that, like how many of those actually would love to see, full universality as an eventual outcome, versus those who really just want to make the SRD larger and better, but then not necessarily want to go to the universal route.
We're actually in the midst of doing an audit, or what we're calling a scorecard, of parties' positions on basic income, including the question of universality ahead of the election. So the scorecard is kind of intended to be a voter resource where they can quickly and easily compare where parties fall on different aspects of basic income policy. And we're really trying to bring the detail to the fore. So I can tell you exactly how many parties are committed to universality. And a full commitment to universality for the adult population, there are only 2 parties, but relatively major parties who have expressed this commitment. One is called the Good Party, and one is Action SA, who have a very progressive universal basic income policy, although have also, unfortunately, expressed some more populist, xenophobic views, which lead us to wonder whether immigrants or foreign nationals would be included in their universal basic income policy. But then there are a number of other parties that fall somewhere along the spectrum between expanding the SRD grant and introducing a universal basic income grant. The ANC, the current governing party, has expressed their support for universality in principle and has said in their policy that they will work towards universality over time. And then there are other parties who have, I guess, paid lip service a little bit to the idea of a UBI, but then in the fine print said, well, it's not happening anytime soon. But I think that goes to show just how much the idea of a basic income and a universal basic income has become part of the kind of political debate in South Africa, and it's widely understood by a large proportion of the voting population, and it's very much on the agenda. And parties can't really get away this election with not having a position on basic income, universal basic income, which we that's something I think that ought to be celebrated in and of itself.
Yeah. Just to add, Scott, I think it's significant that Kelly has outlined, some of the parties. I think not just looking at the number of parties, but looking at their level of support. I think it's safe to say that a majority, in terms of what we expect, majority of votes will go to parties that support some form of universal basic income, as Kelly has described. And this is a big shift. This is a big shift from what the situation would have been a few years ago. So yeah, significant ground is being gained. But as Kelly said, some of the commitments are subject to qualifiers, subject to a lot of contestation. Once it gets through the government process.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see just how the elections play out. As how well these parties do this election for backing basic income to any degree, and also, of course, what happens when they get elected for those who do run on it, and is their support real? Do they really fight for this? And especially like a progressive, universal kind of improving version or whatever, versus just paying lip service and stuff. Fingers crossed. We have our first listener asking a question. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Katazopas. I don't know if
Hi
that's
there.
correct or not. But yeah, do you have a question for Neil or Kelly? And thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks. I think I'm actually quite a good time to jump in. My name is Caden Argyle. I'm the youth leader for the Good Party, one of the two mentioned parties that actually was just covered.
Oh, great.
And the Universal Basic Income Grant is basically the main pillar of our party's, economic stance and, our belief in economic justice. So, and I also just want to, just make a quick correction. Kelly, first of all, I want to say thanks for the space. It's been very informative, especially for people who've been trying to, convince many South Africans across the country about this. Small correction, the xenophobia kind of thing, 100% on the other party. None of our party's rhetoric or anything about that has any distinction about people who are obviously refugees or foreign nationals, etc., and having that specific exclusion. But my question is specifically centered around the research that you guys basically mentioned earlier about the cost to basically job seek. And my question is, out of all of the different sectors we mentioned about transport, etc., if there was one sector that could be recovered in South Africa, which one would basically help this basic income grant the most in terms of elevating people out of poverty and getting into, workspaces, as well as just having a work life that's just not meant for, going to sleep and then having all your basic necessities covered, but rather working to live? Thank you so much.
If I could just quickly reply to that, thank you. Thank you for making that clarification. And I very much was referring to the other party and not to Good when I made the comment about anti-immigrant sentiment. I don't know if Neil might want to speak to that other question.
I wasn't sure about, what you're talking about in terms of sector. Do you mean like the youth? Do you mean like the unemployed, the working poor, the caregivers? I mean,
I'm speaking more about the sentiment of, you spoke about transport, which is obviously a sector in the country that needs to be, upgraded massively to solve spatial apartheid, spatial planning on an apartheid basis. So if it was, crime, if it was corruption, if it was proper management, if it was transport, if one sector theoretically could be solved today, which one would help, a basic income grant basically elevate itself the most in terms of have the most impact on society, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, if you look at the whole issue that Scott was raising of the economic multipliers, and Kelly's spoken quite a bit about the impact we've seen of the SRD on, for example, informal workers, etc. The critical question is, how do you take, I refer to the 100 billion rand that has gone into poor communities. How do you maximize the impact of that stimulus, of that income into those communities, and ensure that it's not just the large retailers, for example, who are just creaming off the value that is being spent in these large stores, and ensuring that, for example, it's going to informal traders, that it's promoting small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So, that also comes to, other policies around the food systems, around competition policy. And I think it's important to say that as the IEJ and also as our coalition partners, we don't present the universal basic income as a silver bullet for South Africa's problems. We see it as needing to be part of a much broader package of measures, including, a much more activist industrial policy, a much more developmental macroeconomic policy. We have a situation in South Africa where, because of the sort of contraction of, spending and a very tight monetary policy, these result in a stagnation in economic activity and sort of boost unemployment. So to have the impact that you desire, basic income would need to be combined with changes in all these areas of policy, and that's the position that we've taken as the IEJ. At the same time, the massive benefit of the basic income is that its impact is immediate. You transfer the cash into people's pockets. It has an immediate impact. You don't have to wait for a massive infrastructure program to be rolled out. We have a big problem with corruption in South Africa. How do you ensure that these programs benefit the intended beneficiaries? Whereas with cash transfers, there's far lower corruption, and the impact is immediate. And this is something that the president really appreciated when we spoke to him, was to say that, in terms of addressing the immediate crisis, this is a measure which can immediately have a massive impact. But in order to have the sort of transformation that you desire in society, it needs to be combined with a range of other measures, as I indicated. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caden. Yeah, I would mention too that again, since Neil mentioned this as not being a silver bullet, and I feel I have to stress this a lot too, or basically every UBI advocate needs to stress this when people will just reflexively turn it away and say, oh, you want some utopian place where this solves everything. And no, of course not. And UBI I see it as a foundation, and I'm constantly stressing that it is this foundational floor. And so when you see it as that floor, then you see that so much of what we do is about treating the absence of a floor. So crime is so much higher than it would otherwise be because of poverty, insecurity, and extreme inequality. And so, if we had a basic income, it wouldn't eliminate all crime, of course, but I do think that it would reduce it significantly. And that's, I think, is something that's important, just like we could improve health significantly, and therefore, reduce all the resources that we put into treating the downstream health impacts of poverty, insecurity, and inequality. So I guess that's kind of my own answer to Ken's question, is just that having that floor, I think, would just have a multitude of positive impacts.
Absolutely. And Scott, I think, just an example of what you're saying is in the basic income trials in Namibia, they found that crime dropped by 40% in those areas where they trialed basic income. So yeah, I mean, those impacts have definitely been shown and demonstrated. But I think the issue that you're raising, Scott, is also a very interesting research question, which is, what are the hidden benefits of basic income in terms of reducing sort of health costs, reducing, a range of other costs in society in terms of policing, et cetera, et cetera. And I know there's been some modeling in the States and in the UK on this issue, and that's something that we're also quite keen to do in South Africa.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to just see more studies done on the SRD grant, however small that it is. It's just I know from all this other research that I've seen that it doesn't really take all that much to really feel an increase in security and this decrease in severe deprivation that has just so many positive impacts. Surprisingly, for the amount of basic income that's been, tested and that we see these impacts from. I don't think Kelly is not with us anymore. Maybe she's not able to speak anymore.
I'm seeing her. I see she's a listener rather than a speaker.
Yeah, I re-invited her after
Okay.
she was lost. I don't know if she'll be able to accept it again. But I'm just curious, Neil, do you have any like favorite anecdotes? Just we always speak so much of data and studies and these things, but I really like to uplift stories that kind of make these data points more understandable. Do you happen to have any stories from South Africa where someone did something with the SRD grant that they wouldn't have been otherwise able to do that kind of illustrates this?
No, there have been, and it's a pity that we've got an organization called Pay the Grant in South Africa as one of our partners. In fact, they're a partner in our court case, and they organize grant beneficiaries. So it's a pity. I asked them if they could make it, but I don't think they could make it tonight. Definitely, I mean, there are a lot of anecdotes around that. And the president, for example, in one of his State of the Nation addresses, spoke about this young guy who received the SRD grant and set up an ice cream making operation. And in fact, we had a meeting with the General Secretary of Good. You were hearing from the youth leader just now from Good, and he was saying that Good, because Good is proposing a 1,000 rand basic income, that they gave 1,000 to a certain number. I think he said 30 or something people to see what would happen in terms of the impact on their lives. And he said this, one man who was a welder managed to then buy some, steel or whatever, and then set up a sort of burglar bar sort of business. So there definitely are these stories, but we don't want to romanticize it in the sense that, really, I mean, this is like just such a tiny amount. It needs to be significantly increased before you can really have good sort of sustained stories. It's amazing what people do with so little, but that's also based on the reality that people pool their resources in poor communities. It's not like the one person with the 350 is, doing everything. It's like people are putting their resources together in the household with relatives, etc., and then they are using those resources collectively to do whatever it is, to invest and so on. I mean, the recent study by Give Directly in Kenya is very interesting. I'm sure. I mean, of course, you've seen it. I'm sure, Scott, but also other listeners. I would encourage them to look at it. The first 2 years' results have just come out of that study, and what they show is that those who are receiving the money on a 2-year basis, as opposed to those who are getting it for 12 years and those who got a lump sum, were much more cautious in terms of what they did with that money. They just used it for immediate, necessities. Whereas people who knew that they would be getting the money for 12 years have used it to more sort of boldly, pull the money, invest in small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a real lesson that, a permanent basic income is so important in terms of giving people a stability that they can do certain things, knowing that they're going to get that income tomorrow.
Yeah, also interesting to consider how different it could potentially be. Just you mentioned that the SRD, of course, is very low, and so the impacts aren't as good as they otherwise could be. But also, the SRD has been I don't know how long this is going to continue kind of policy, whereas once it's made permanent in the form of a basic income guarantee, not only would it be a higher amount, but also people could expect it. Right. And it's that expectation that would have this larger impact, as was shown in the Kenya results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even for the department that's administering it, the officials complain because they never know if it's going to be extended on a year-to-year basis. So there's no proper planning, and so at least now it seems like the message is clear that this is now going to be a permanent thing, but there is going to be a transition to a different system. And that's going to require the policy and the legislation, et cetera, to go through Parliament. And that's why we're hoping when the new administration comes in, they're going to make this one of their top priorities. I mean, one of the things, by the way, Scott, is that, there's widespread speculation that the ANC, the governing party, is not going to get a majority in these elections. And that's very possible, in which case they are going to have to enter into coalitions with other parties. And hopefully it'll be parties like Good, for example, who are represented here, who are very committed to basic income, and other parties who are not hostile to the idea of basic income, who will be part of that coalition and will help, to push it forward.
Yeah, that would certainly be putting the president in the position where he'd, have to put his support where his mouth was, as far as is he willing to work together as coalition partners to do this, or is it something that he was just kind of saying in order to hopes of maintaining his status as majority party?
Sure.
Yeah, interesting. Neil, I know you said we had you for an hour and a half, and we're at an hour and a half. Did you want to go ahead and leave us with any final thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if any of your other listeners have any questions, Scott. I'm happy to, respond if there are any further questions, or we can sort of round up, I guess.
Yeah, if anyone wants to raise your hand, please do so now before Neil needs to get going.
I don't know, from your side, Scott, I mean, thanks for this opportunity. It's really a fantastic platform to be able to talk about, the South African experience, which I think, on the global platform is a little bit it's gone a bit under the radar in terms of its significance, I think. So really appreciate the opportunity. I don't know from your side, Scott, whether there's anything that you'd like me to finish off on, but I think, we've canvassed so many aspects of the discussion that I didn't really have anything sort of pressing to add.
Yeah, no, I just have been really interested in these developments that I've been watching in South Africa, both before and especially after COVID. And it's not like I have my money on any certain country and they're running some kind of betting kind of set up to see which country will be first. But I do like to get people to think about that and ask that question sometimes. Just say, hey, who do you think would be the first country to introduce some kind of basic income? Sure. And or at least some major step towards it? And I really think that South Africa is up there, and so I hope that ends up being the case. I'm very curious myself as to see what happens here during your elections at the end of the month. and how that all plays out. But yeah, thank you for doing everything you are doing with at IEJ to push this in South Africa. And I hope that this conversation can also be useful too. Like you'll be to be able to share this space afterwards. Be hey, if you're curious about the details of South Africa, here you go.
Yes,
So
yes.
hopefully that'll be really useful.
No, no, absolutely. Scott, thanks for all the support, and maybe we can touch base in a year or so and see what has actually transpired.
Yep, indeed. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Kelly, as well. I know you're not around to say anything after this, but I think you're still hearing this. So yeah, thank you as well for contributing to the discussion.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Neil.
Bye-bye.
Well, looks like, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy uh, to add anything else. But if no one else has anything, then we can go ahead and end this discussion a little bit earlier than usual. We'd usually go for a full 2 hours, but so we had some great guests today, and my co-hosts aren't here today, and I think it's good to just end now. I think so. Yeah, thank you all for listening today, and this is feel free to share this discussion after the fact, so other people can listen to the recording of it, and this recording will eventually be up on Comingle's YouTube channel, uh, where you'll be able to share the YouTube version of it at some point. And yeah, thank you all for listening, and see you next time.